Let's talk about some concepts in costing. I want to introduce you to two terms if you haven't heard these before. One is capital expenses, and the other is operational expenses. And sometimes people abbreviate this by saying CapEx and OpEx. A capital expense is money spent on a long-term asset, like property, equipment, specifically maybe a data center or computers or laptops or something like that. An operational expense is something that a business spends money on just to keep the business running, and it's usually considered a variable expense, meaning they can choose to scale back and pay less or use more and pay more. Now let's look at a very common budgeting cycle for an IT shop. And for a typical IT shop, the budgeting cycle many times centers around depreciation. And this is an accounting concept that allows for companies to spend an expense, a large expense, over time, say several years. Now, accounting standards may differ, but usually companies decide how long they want to depreciate an asset. And let's say in this case, it's 5 years. So as a CIO, I might only get to make a big purchase every 5 years. And because these numbers, these purchases are usually very large, there's a lot of work and a lot of scrutiny that goes into that particular budgeting ask. One of the most difficult things that I have to try to do is predict what needs my internal business partners are going to have over the course of the next 5 years. And then I usually build in extra capacity into my present day budgetary ask to accommodate that. The problem is that most of the time that is a complete guess. My internal business partners might barely know what's going to happen in the next 12 months, let alone the next 5 years. And so many things can change in those 5 years, like the economic market, competition, regulation, technology advancements, and so on. But I don't really have a choice. I only get one chance every 5 years to make this purchase. Now, ideally, my forecast of IT assets might look like this. It's gradually consumed over the years, and my costs are more or less fixed, whether I use the capacity or not. Or it might also look like this if certain projects are canceled. Now, I'm sitting on a lot of aging excess IT assets where the organization could have better spent that money on maybe marketing or research and development. Or my capacity might look like this, where demand outpaces my capacity and I guessed wrong. And then in these cases, I might have to do emergency purchases. And because these are one-off, I'm likely not going to get the benefit of some economies of scale in a negotiation for a large purchase. And I'm probably going to end up with different models of equipment, which is probably going to drive up my cost of ownership. Now, in comparison, an OpEx cost model makes use of variable costs. And I buy the capacity as I need it. And if demand goes down, I stop using those resources and stop paying for those resources. This is one of the benefits of pay-as-you-go cloud computing. Now, there are some providers who call themselves cloud providers, but their business model is such that they want to get a 3 to 5 year contract in a fixed fee basis. And that almost mimics CapEx. These companies are more like hosting providers or co-location partners. And that's different. That's not what I'm talking about here. Specifically, I'm talking about the pay-per-use models of AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud Platform, for example. Now, two costing terms you're going to hear about frequently, if you haven't already, is total cost of ownership and return on investment. Total cost of ownership is just a comprehensive look at the entire cost model of a given decision. And it includes generally the hard costs, but also the soft costs. Return on investment is I'm going to give you a certain amount of money, and this is the amount of return I can expect to receive back. Now, note that return on investment isn't necessarily always a positive. Maybe it's just a break even, or maybe it's less of a loss than I would if I hadn't invested that money. But when you're talking about these terms, be very, very careful, because in the immortal words of General Akbar, it's a trap. The reason is that many times organizations don't have a good handle on their full on-prem data center costs. And this includes stuff like power and cooling and fire suppression and just the real estate involved in supporting a data center. And soft costs are rarely tracked or even really understood. A lot of companies don't really pay much attention to the soft costs. And what I'm talking about soft costs here is the difficulty or the overhead or the extra time that it requires to maintain something. And a lot of times that's just kind of rolled into headcount or subscriptions or something like that. And when we talk about migrating to the cloud, the learning curve is going to be very different from person to person. A lot of times companies don't give this learning curve enough respect or enough runway for people to get fully up to speed. So when you initially move to the cloud, it's very likely that your expenses and time required is going to be much higher than it was in your on-prem world because people were very familiar with that world. And so there's a degree of inefficiency that has to be worked out so that you realize some of those benefits in the long run. Now, business plans usually include a lot of assumptions, which in turn require other assumptions, which in turn require other assumptions. And a lot of times support organizations like IT are several layers down on that assumption chain. So for example, the business plan may say that we're going to go to market with a new business model and we expect to earn maybe $3 million in sales the first year. But it requires a total overhaul of our e-commerce system before we can introduce that new business model. So therefore, as a CIO, I must assume that the e-commerce project is on the critical path and budget accordingly. Therefore, the IT infrastructure team has to budget for new hardware to host the project landscape and maybe some additional headcount to manage it. But if the market conditions change and the company decided to delay the new business model, that easily messes with all the IT assumptions that I've built into my plan. My suggestion overall is don't go it alone. Unless you're a finance person or you have a finance degree and you know that world very well, get help from your folks in your accounting and finance department to help build a TCO and ROI that is based on fact and can stand up to the scrutiny of many of your other business partners.